dynasty and all that.
Chinese kingdoms earlier. So when was that?
Now maybe we should do a short overview of the history of Tibet. Tibet has a well accepted history of more than 2,200, 2,300 years. And before that, of course, the Shangshun dynasty and all that, so it goes back many thousands of years. But there are also stories that the first king of Tibet came from India, Prince Rupati. So the India-Tibet relation is very, very old. And then there was also a sacred text, a Buddhist text, in the hand of a Tibetan king in 3rd century. That was the first Buddhist text into Tibet. And then 7th century, the Tibetan emperor sent a minister to invent the Tibetan script. So the Tibetan script also comes from India. It's based on Brahmi and Gupta script. Because some people ask us, since now that Tibet is occupied by China, whether Tibetan language has anything to do with Chinese language, which is not. The script came from India. Even now, if I say Kaka Kanga, Cha Cha Chanya, Tata Thana, it's very similar to Hindi consonants.
Yes.
And we have only 4 vowels, E, U, A, O, whereas you have A, E, U, A, O, Aha, so many vowels. So the language also comes from India. And then between 7th to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. We even dislodged the Chinese emperor and put a puppet king there in the Chinese capital of Xiangyang those days, or Xi'an. And the Tibetan empire also extended up to present-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. So that used to be the extent of Tibetan empire between 7th to 9th century. Then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years. Then Genghis Khan became a big power in Central Asia. And we built relations with the 5th Khan, Kublai Khan, and his father, with the Satrapas. So we built relations with the Mongols around 1247 with Kublai Khan's father, and later Satya Pandita's nephew worked with Kublai Khan then we developed this priest-patron relationship. So the Mongols invaded China in 1271. And then it became the Yuan dynasty. So Mongols were there even before Yuan dynasty and after Yuan dynasty. But for the Chinese historians, from 1271 to 1368 was the period when Mongols ruled China. It's not the Chinese who ruled China, but the Mongols ruled China from China. And then Tibet was ruled by the Satrapas during that period. And then following the Mongol invasion of China, the Mongols were dislodged by the Mings, who are the real Chinese, Han Chinese, because you're talking about 56 nationalities within China, and Han Chinese are the majority. Of course, there are a lot of intellectual discourses as to who's the real Chinese. Are Mongols Chinese, Manchus Chinese, Tibetans Chinese? If Mongols are Chinese, then China can claim half of the world because Genghis Khan conquered that much area. So the Mings ruled China from 1368 to 1644, whereas Tibet, in comparative history, was ruled by 3 dynasties. The Pamodrupa dynasty for about 100 years, Rinpoche for about 100 years, and Tepa Sangpa for about 100 years, from 1368 to 1642. Then the 5th Dalai Lama took over the spiritual and temporal leadership in 1642, 2 years before the Manchus or the Qings dislodged the Mings in China. So you can see a difference of 2 years where the 5th Dalai Lama. So since then, from 1642 to till now, the successive Dalai Lamas have been ruling Tibet, and then China was ruled by the Manchus, who are not Chinese. The societal perspective of the Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. They are invaders. They are barbarians. So you build those a Great Wall to keep the barbarians away. So today, the Great Wall is the backbone, not the boundary of China, with what they call as the barbarians for Mongols, Manchus, Tibetans, and all that. So around 1720, after the 5th Dalai Lama, the 6th Dalai Lama came, and then the Manchus came into Tibet, essentially to support the Tibetans against the Gurkha invasion, Nepalese invasion of Tibet. But they didn't have to fight a war. They went back without having to fight a war. Again, they came back in 1790s. late 18th century, and then they claimed that they invented this golden urn for the selection of Dalai Lama and all that. So those were Manchu influences in Tibet. But Tibet was never directly ruled by the Chinese, till the end of the Manchu Empire. In between, you had the Young Husband expedition of Tibet in 1904, when Young Husband came up to Lhasa in 1904. But where were the Chinese then? And Indian historians, I won't call them historians because they don't go deep into Tibetan history, but at least those who study about Tibet, they like to say Tibet became independent since 1913. Because we kicked out every single Chinese from Tibet in 1912, so that is why you still see some Chinese in Kolkata, because we didn't send them directly through Tibet, but send them through India so that they don't come back with reinforcement. But by that time, the nationalists had taken over and they were not very much in a position to...
It's a very interesting piece of history, sir.
Yeah.
They went to Calcutta.
They were sent through Kolkata back to China. So many of them stayed back in Kalimpong, Darjeeling area.
Okay.
But after 1962 war, they were also removed from those places, and some of them still stay in Kolkata. That is why you still have, not all the Chinese in Kolkata were from Tibet, because the 13th Dalai Lama went to, after the Young Husband expedition, had to leave to Mongolia and then again to China from 1904 to 1909. And then the 13th Dalai Lama came back to Tibet. Took about a year for him to come because he also preaches on the way. And 3 months after he was in Lhasa, the Chinese came from Kham area. They killed so many Khampas in 1910. And it took 2 years for the Tibetans to kick out every Chinese. And then the 13th Dalai Lama reiterated the independence of Tibet, not announced like it's a new country. It was there. So then Mongolia and Tibet also signed an agreement. And then there was the Shimla Agreement of 1914, where McMahon Line was devised between British India and independent Tibet. So even today, we are committed to the Shimla Agreement and the McMahon Line because we were signatories to that. Chinese were part of it, but they did not ratify it eventually. So all those historical relations were there. And Tibet remained an independent state till Chinese occupation in 1950, when China forcefully occupied Chamdo in eastern Tibet. And that was the attack of the eastern garrison. And then we were forced to sign this so-called 17-point agreement in 1951. That is why even now I keep telling the international community, we have only one agreement, or with the Communist Chinese, that is the 17-point agreement. And then they themselves trampled on every provision of that agreement, all the 17 points. We tried to live under that agreement for 8 years, from 1951 to 1959, before His Holiness came into exile. So since China trampled on all the provisions, then we had to also abrogate that agreement. So it was 1959, October 5, when China invaded Tibet from the east, and then we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement in May 23, 1951.
So there was a significant time, sir, more than thousands of years, when Tibet was it had its own identity.
Yes.
It had its own politics, its own religion, its own culture, its own script, its own language, its own food. Nothing to do with China. Rather, Tibetans had at one point in time conquered China, sat in their capital, and like you mentioned, sir.
There was also this story about when we developed relations with Mongols. Mongols were merciless. They Genghis Khan, if he had to invade Delhi, he comes from Panipat and he kills everybody in Panipat. By the time he reaches Delhi, everybody surrenders because he was merciless.
Yes.
And they were killing a lot of Chinese. They were throwing Chinese into the sea. And the Tibetan masters told them not to kill the Chinese. Actually, Tibetans saved Chinese life during the Mongol times in the initial state. But we have to suffer this fate, not having done anything against the Chinese. But now we are suffering under the Chinese.
My question is, sir, that, this is about the history and how His Holiness came to India.
Abs are made in the kitchen.